Welcome to Trauma-Informed Practices for Leaders. Today we'll review a few topics including what is trauma, understanding the various types of trauma, further resources for learning, trauma-informed operations, HR, sales, and marketing, and tools for self-care as trauma-informed leaders. A few words to ponder before we dive in today. We believe that those closest to the pain are closest to the solution. This quote was offered to me in a recent training I attended through the Trauma Center Trauma Sensitive Yoga Program. It was attributed to Until Freedom, which is an organization co-founded by Tamika Mallory, who is a civil rights activist and founder of the Women's March and author of the book State of Emergency. This quote resonates with me deeply because in my experience with my own personal journey of healing from trauma, and also in my experience of being a leader in nonprofit and business sectors who are serving communities impacted by trauma, it's so important for us to listen to the voices that have been most deeply impacted by trauma, and for us to actively listen and uplift these voices. And one of the reasons why I bring this up is because there is so much research on trauma and trauma recovery. And in addition to that, each person's recovery from trauma is really unique. And it's something I'll touch base on a bit later in this presentation. But I just want you to keep this in mind as we move through this presentation together, is that each story of each survivor, each experience is really unique to the individual and really deserves our honor and our appreciation and our support as we dive into this education and research and further resources about our clinical understanding of trauma. Tell your stories so that if someone else hears it, they know they are not alone. This is a quote from one of my favorite journalists, and it has inspired me over the years to tell a little bit about my own story in each of my webinars or workshops or online courses, simply to connect with others and also to share a bit about where I'm standing and where I'm coming from as I'm sharing this information with you today. I am a trauma survivor and a queer single parent living with C-PTSD. I've been passionate about trauma recovery my entire adult life. I've been a healing arts practitioner and social justice activist for nearly 20 years. I've also been a board member and volunteer for over a dozen nonprofits and grassroots organizations around the globe. And I'm currently the CEO and founder of our agency, Present Moment Media. I want to share a few thoughts on scope of practice before we dive in today. Scope of practice is a theory that we discuss, especially as health and wellness practitioners, and it refers to what are we really allowed to diagnose? What are we really allowed to treat? What are we really allowed to discuss as health and wellness practitioners? And in this presentation today, I want to name that my scope of practice and my perspective that I am sharing from today is my own clinical background in yoga and Ayurveda, in addition to my experience as a trauma survivor and my own healing journey and everything I've learned from my own healing process, in addition to nearly 2 decades of service and leadership in both a nonprofit and business realm, and often working with survivors of trauma and communities who have been impacted by trauma. So I just want to name that this is really my perspective and my scope of practice. My intention today is not to diagnose or treat any survivors of trauma. It is not to provide any certification for those who are interested in treating trauma, but simply to offer my own experiences and further resources for learning in terms of what it means to be a trauma-informed leader. You are ready to transform your leadership skills through a trauma-informed lens, then let's talk about trauma. Trauma is a pervasive problem. It results from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and/or spiritual well-being. Although trauma can occur at any age, it has particularly debilitating long-term effects on children's developing brains. Often referred to as adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, exposure to these experiences is common across all sectors of society. However, research has shown that the risk for ACEs is particularly elevated within certain populations, such as people who identified as Black, Hispanic, or multiracial, people with less than a high school education, people with low income or were unemployed or unable to work, and people who identified as a member of the LGBTQ population. I have shared this information from a resource known as the Trauma-Informed Care Implementation Research Center, and their website is shared here at the bottom of this slide. This is a definition of trauma that is very basic, but I feel as if it covers many of the foundational aspects that I hope to cover in this presentation today, and we'll learn more as we continue further into this webinar. I want to share just a few thoughts on understanding the different types of trauma. One of the reasons that I want to share this with you is because as someone who lives with C-PTSD, there have been so many occasions when I expressed to someone in my own personal life that I was a survivor of trauma and that I lived with chronic symptoms of trauma, and their immediate response was, "Oh, you live with PTSD." And when I tried to explain that my diagnosis was actually C-PTSD, many people had no idea what the difference was between the two. They had no idea that C-PTSD was even a diagnosis. They had no idea what I was talking about. And so just as part of my own journey, I have found that this is a source of misunderstanding in the general population. And so I just want to share a few thoughts and just a really brief overview about the difference between a few of the different types of trauma that we understand currently according to the Western medical system. PTSD is limited to isolated events, either a single event or a series of isolated events. And the understanding we have of PTSD is heavily based on the research on veterans, especially after the Vietnam War. C-PTSD was further studied, as I mentioned earlier, quite a number of years after PTSD was initially studied in the late 70s by Judith Herman. And she discovered how it occurs within relationships, how it occurred in childhood, and really what one of the main differences is between PTSD and C-PTSD is that it occurs over an extended period of time. DES-NOS, which stands for Disorders of Extreme Stress Not Otherwise Specified, is yet another diagnosis that was offered to trauma survivors during a specific period of time. In our clinical research and understanding of trauma in the US, complex trauma is now a term that's used interchangeably with the two previously aforementioned categories of trauma. And it speaks to not only childhood exposure to trauma, but also the long-term effects of trauma. DTD, or developmental trauma disorder, is a newer diagnosis that is exclusively offered to children. And so in looking at these first 5 different categories, it really depends on so many scenarios as to which diagnosis might be appropriate for each individual. It really depends on at which stage in their life they experienced the trauma, whether they were an adult, whether they were a child, whether the effects were short-term or long-term, whether the trauma occurred over a short period of time or over an extended long period of time. There's so many factors that go into each diagnosis, and I don't have the time or the capacity or training really to dive into each different category in the way they each deserve. But I just want to share with you that there is a difference between these different types of trauma, and for you to just begin to understand that trauma is not an isolated event or an experience. Last but not least, I want to mention, and this is really important in our own understanding of trauma as leaders, is the social, historical, and generational trauma. And this speaks to the impact of colonization, racism, misogyny, socioeconomic disparity, and many other forms of oppression that perpetuate systemic, social, and generational trauma. There is a wheel of power and privilege that I've included in the slides later on in the presentation that I believe will speak more deeply to this point. And I've included some further resources about this aspect of trauma as well. Yet another aspect of trauma research that I have found is not as commonly known, at least among my peers, is the ACEs pyramid, also known as Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This study helps us to understand that the more types of trauma that one experiences during childhood or adolescence, the greater impact it has on our health and well-being as adults, and how it impacts us really for the rest of our lives as survivors of trauma. And so one of the things that is different about this particular graphic is, if you notice at the bottom where it says general embodiment, generational embodiment, historical trauma, social conditions, and local context, these are newer additions to this pyramid. But when I first saw this updated graphic, it really brought so much peace and understanding to my own mind and heart, because this is a really critical component of my own journey and my own understanding of trauma. And so through this pyramid, we can see how all these various levels of trauma, through our generational or historical exposure, through the socioeconomic conditions, the political conditions we experience, how that also impacts our childhood experience, and how that further leads to disruption of our own health and well-being later on in life. I want to share with you just a few resources to get started in terms of trauma recovery, in case you are not familiar with any of these modalities or treatments. Yet again, I want to say that I am not recommending these treatments to anyone in particular, but just want to share that these are a few resources that you may be interested in learning more about. Somatic experiencing is one of the most well-known treatments in the United States for trauma and complex trauma. One thing I will say about somatic experiencing and the organization and the impact of that training is that what I've seen, just as a person who is interested in this field and in the healing and recovery of trauma, is that there are many practitioners now that are really making an effort to center LGBTQ and BIPOC practitioners within the somatic experiencing network. And what I will say is that from my experience, that is not necessarily how the training is presented or focused, but there is a movement to make this practice more inclusive. And so one of my colleagues actually shared with me a list of BIPOC and LGBTQ somatic experiencing practitioners in the United States. And so if that's something you're interested in and you want that list of practitioners, please feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to share it with you. Trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga is the organization that I have recently been studying with, and they have intentionally created a foundation that is based on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I am really appreciative of the work that they are doing. They have many decades of research to back up the work they are doing. And not only that, it's incredibly inclusive and rooted in social justice. And so I really highly recommend their programs. If you haven't heard of them, this is definitely a resource that I would recommend to you as well, just to check out and see if their work aligns with you and is maybe of further interest to you. Embodiment-based therapies in general are often highly recommended for survivors of trauma. What I mean by somatic or embodiment really comes back to many decades of research about the impact of trauma, which is that we store many of our own experiences of trauma in the body and in our physiology. And so it's not only a cognitive experience, it's a physical and physiological experience. And so in working through various practices such as movement or breath work or other practices that involve not only the mind, but integrate the body and the breath as well, these practices can be incredibly transformative for survivors of trauma. And again, there's many decades of research to support this theory. And this does not have to necessarily just include yoga. There are many other practices that draw on the wisdom of movement and breath work and incorporate these elements of Western psychology into what we know now as somatic or embodiment-based therapies. An integrative East-West approach combining multiple therapeutic services to support the survivor. Yet again, this is not my own personal recommendation to anyone else, but what I will say from my own understanding and my own experience is that there is no one treatment for the recovery of trauma, and there is evidence to verify that not only is trauma an incredibly complex experience and how it's really unique to each individual in terms of the signs and symptoms, but that each individual often requires a unique treatment plan. And so this may be a combination of many different types of modalities, and it may be that each survivor benefits from a combination of, say, therapy, yoga, maybe other practices as well. There's no one right or wrong treatment. And what I have found is that the Western allopathic model for myself is helpful but incomplete. And I want to just say that is my own experience, and that isn't the experience of everyone, but there is adequate research to support that a few of these other practices, such as trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, and other movement and breathwork-based therapies, are incredibly supportive to the healing and recovery from trauma as well. As I mentioned earlier, the path to healing is unique to the individual. One thing that I want to mention is that several of the diagnoses of trauma that we discussed earlier are not currently included in the DSM, which is the manual that mental health professionals use to diagnose and treat mental health conditions, including C-PTSD, which is the diagnosis that I have and have lived with my entire life. And it is really interesting as a human being to walk through the world with a diagnosis that isn't currently recognized by our current medical system. And so, in thinking about this through the lens of yoga, but especially in Ayurveda, what I think about is that we are faced with an opportunity to provide creative solutions and to really provide unique experiences and healing for survivors of trauma. Here are a few further resources if this topic of learning about trauma and the history of trauma and clinical research and understanding is of interest to you. Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga by David Emerson was one of the first books that I ever read on this topic, and I believe it was over a decade ago, but it was one of the most life-changing books of my entire life. David Emerson was a staff member of the Trauma Center and is still actively involved in the Trauma Center for Trauma-Sensitive Yoga program that I recently attended the foundational training through their organization. And I cannot recommend this book enough to anyone interested in this topic. Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine really looks at the experience of trauma in nature and relates that to our own human experience. It's definitely a more clinical lens, but is really helpful in understanding our own experiences of trauma. Flowers in the Dark is a book written by a Vietnamese and Buddhist nun who studies and practices in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. This frames the recovery of trauma through a modern Buddhism lens and may be of interest to anyone who is interested in mindfulness or meditation in the recovery of trauma. My Grandmother's Hands is a book that really speaks to the racial trauma and also the history of colonization and the impact it has on trauma in the West. It's an incredible book that is also highly recommended if that's of interest to you. The first 4 books I have read. The next 2 books are on my reading list, but were recommended to me highly by the trauma training that I just attended, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman and The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris. Last but not least, if you want to learn more about this organization where I've been studying, traumasensitiveyoga.com is their website. They also have an incredible research section where they list many clinical studies about trauma and the use of yoga, meditation, and mindfulness in the recovery of trauma. And so that's a resource that I highly recommend as well. In terms of applying these practices to leadership, this is something that I have really cultivated slowly over the course of many years in my own practice of leadership. And when I first stepped into my first nonprofit board position or my first operations position, no one handed me a manual that said, this is what it means to be a trauma-informed leader. And I tell you right now that I sincerely wish that they had offered that manual to me, because it would have prevented many hard lessons that I've had to learn over the years. But one of my hopes is to begin this conversation and to continue to share my own experiences of what I have learned, in hopes that it helps to support and inspire other people in positions of leadership. This entire webinar was really based on 3 components. So education and resources, which we just shared, and self-care, which are really critical. The 3 main components that I will cover today, and it's definitely not entirely inclusive of what I believe you need to understand as a trauma-informed leader, but these are 3 pillars that I believe are really crucial to begin understanding and exploring as trauma-informed leaders. And so I want to share with you just a few ways that you can begin to incorporate the trauma-informed lens into an operations or a human resources approach. The first of which is nonviolent communication and active listening. If you have not read the book Nonviolent Communication, it's definitely one that I recommend, and it's something that I think back on many times as both a human and a leader. In addition to that, active listening is a really important practice to me in both my personal and professional life. When it comes to survivors, one of the things that I want to mention is it's a common experience for survivors to feel unheard or invalidated or even gaslighted. And so if you're a person in leadership and there is a member of your team or perhaps one of your clients that is sharing with you, especially something vulnerable with you, I believe that active listening can be an incredibly helpful practice in becoming a more trauma-informed leader. And so there's much I can say about what that means, but reflecting back what you've heard and clarifying what a person is trying to share with you before making assumptions or before making recommendations. These are just a few ideas or suggestions, and it goes much deeper. But I would definitely recommend diving deeper into NVC and active listening as practices for leadership. Involve those impacted by decisions and decision-making. And one of the things that I have learned in my own experience of leadership is that if I want to make a decision for my company, if it impacts anyone else on my team besides myself, that it's really important for me to ask for feedback and to include the voices of those impacted by those decisions. For instance, if I have a new project I'm working on with a client and I want to bring in another staff member, before I give our clients perhaps a quote on the project or the scope of the project or how long it might take us to complete it, it's something I always circle back to my teammates about before I confirm with a client. And this is just one example, but I believe this is a really important practice in trauma-informed leadership as well. Implement diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. This is a scratch on the surface of an entire presentation and much deeper training in itself. But in terms of operations and HR, a few suggestions I wanted to include are having a DEI statement or diversity statement on your website. Also to have a diversity statement in your job description or any job postings that you have, and to make an effort to hire a diverse pool of applicants for your company and to surround yourself with clients and colleagues from diverse backgrounds. Again, this is a scratch on the surface and there's so much more I can say, but this is what's ripe and present for me in this moment. Create space for reflection, feedback, and resolution. And so as a person in leadership, it's really important to me to make an effort to not only actively listen to my clients or to my team members, but to actively question the people around me and ask for their feedback and ask for their reflection, because I want to make sure that we are in agreement and that we are both mutually supportive of any decisions we make together, of any projects we're working on together. And also that if for any reason we are not in agreement, that we make space for resolution. One simple way that we can practice trauma-informed leadership in our day-to-day operations is by including our pronouns and land acknowledgements. That might be on your website, on your social media, in your bio. There's many ways we can include this, but this helps us to acknowledge the trauma that has impacted people of gender nonconforming identities, in addition to Black and Indigenous populations who have been impacted by colonization. In terms of incorporating a trauma-informed lens into sales and marketing, one of the first components that I want to review is obtaining consent. And consent-based sales and consent-based marketing is absolutely one of my core values and our agency in terms of how we operate, but also how we teach our clients and students to implement their own sales and marketing strategies. This may be as simple as requiring a double opt-in for your newsletter. So basically asking for consent before you add someone to your newsletter, asking for consent before you private message someone, and avoiding cold direct messages. Building authentic relationships with potential clients instead of pushy sales tactics. This may be a slower way of generating leads for your business, but it's by far a more ethical approach and more trauma-informed approach. as opposed to being pushy or manipulative in trying to convince someone to sign up for your program. And unfortunately, these practices are really common, especially with high ticket coaches and programs who are teaching sales and marketing. And so just be wary of these tactics. If they are shared with you in a program or training you're attended, be really aware of how this might impact someone, especially a survivor of trauma. Be aware of your messaging and the impact it has on diverse and marginalized populations. There's so many examples I can think of right now, but one of the examples I have seen time and time again in my own experience of running my agency is when people talk about how they offer services exclusively to a certain population. And so one example that comes to mind is, let's say, a coach who only wants to work with women. And so I think it's really important to clarify, are you talking about cis women? Are you talking about straight women? Are you talking about anyone who is a vulva owner? Are you talking about just white women? Who are you talking about? And this really goes back to a fundamental pillar of marketing, which is our ideal client. But it also ties back into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So being really clear about your messaging, who it's impacting, and how that might affect diverse and marginalized populations. Be inclusive in the images you share. And so one of the things that my graphic designers and I on our team at Present Movement Media try to be actively aware of is including images on our website of different bodies. And so including images on our website or social media of bodies that are of different backgrounds. And this helps us to create a space that feels more inclusive to diverse populations. And it also shows your audience that this is a value that you embody as a trauma-informed leader, is that you are intentionally creating a space for people of diverse backgrounds. One of the practices that I try to implement as often as possible, and it's not always possible, but whenever it is possible, we try to offer scholarships and sliding scale rates, etc., to be able to make our programs accessible to diverse populations. Trauma-informed self-care. Why is this important? Yet again, there's so much I want to say, but a few points that are present for me right now. Regulating our own nervous systems as leaders is vital. And so whether or not you identify as a survivor of trauma, as a leader, we experience many situations day in and day out that may activate our nervous system, that may feel stressful, that may feel triggering. And it's really important that we are showing up for our team and for our clients from a space of self-preservation, self-regulation, and self-awareness. And to speak to the second point, knowing when you're not regulated is also incredibly important. Because if we are not in a space where we feel calm and centered and focused and ready for the next task at hand, it is really important for us to acknowledge it and to step away and to maybe cancel or reschedule a meeting, or to maybe let a team member know, hey, I'm feeling under the weather today, and I know I said that I would have this project done by the end of the day. Let me take some time for self-care and I'll work on this for you tomorrow. It's just simple ways that we can recognize when we are not in this space to show up for our clients and our team members in the way that they deserve. And in recognizing it, it's one of the ways that we can be trauma informed by simply recognizing that we need the time and space for ourselves. Reconcile with your own trauma to prevent further harm. And so whenever we are survivors of trauma, as leaders, if we are not taking time for these practices and we're not taking time for our own healing, then these symptoms can show up in our day-to-day life and our day-to-day operations of our business. And so taking the time for our own healing, and then again, recognizing when we're not in a space to be present for others. This is all incredibly important in how we show up for our organizations, our team members, and the communities we serve. Be aware of your own power and privilege as a leader. There is a slide right after this that will share a few more thoughts on what I mean in this topic. But taking time for not only self-care is a term I am using loosely in this presentation. By self-care, I don't mean just yoga and bubble baths. I mean taking time for deep inner reflection and transformation. It's incredibly important for us to do our own inner work of dismantling oppression, racism, misogyny, and all the other forms of oppression that have been deeply ingrained in our minds and hearts and our spirits, to be able to understand how we can be more effective as leaders. Last but not least, to learn tools to offer your clients and students who have been impacted by trauma. And one of the reasons that I'm really passionate about learning how to be a more trauma-informed leader is not so that I can just say I'm a trauma-informed leader. It's not about me having a label. It's about how can I be more effective as a leader and how can I better serve my clients? And one of the ways that I want to better serve my clients is to be able to learn more about the tools that I can share with my clients, especially those who have been impacted by trauma, and how I can empower them to become even more impactful in their own lives and their own organizations. Wheel of power and privilege. This is an interesting diagram, and it's both simple and powerful at the same time, and that's why I love it. In the center of the circle, you will see descriptions that indicate access to power or privilege. And then the farther you move outside of the center, you can understand what it means to experience living as a marginalized person or being a part of a marginalized community. And one thing that you might want to consider is, after this webinar, as we don't have much time to spend on this topic specifically, but to reflect on where you might find yourself in this wheel and to reflect on what that brings up for you. And I just want to empower you in saying that regardless of whether or not you fall within the center of the circle or the outside of the circle, if reflecting on this graphic, brings up any level of discomfort for you, then I want to encourage you to not feel overwhelmed or shut down by that feeling, but to approach it with a sense of curiosity and with a sense of gentleness. And if you are interested in receiving further support around that, then I highly encourage you to find an ally, whether that's me or someone else that you really resonate with in your community, to maybe help you to understand where you fall in this wheel of power and privilege. And this work is incredibly vital as a person in leadership. And so I highly recommend that if this work is new to you, that you again approach it with a sense of gentleness and curiosity and continue to seek resources for support. A few of the practices that have been transformative for me personally in my own recovery of trauma include any practices for engaging the parasympathetic nervous system. In talking about the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system is where we experience the flight, fight, freeze, fawn response, which we understand is triggered by experiences of trauma or chronic stress or other activating experiences. The parasympathetic nervous system is activated during times of rest and digestion and relaxation. And this may look differently for everyone. This may be taking a walk in nature. This may be spending time with your dog. This may be journaling. It's really any kind of activity that helps to bring that sense of relaxation and rejuvenation to you, into your body, not just into your mind, but also into your body. And that's really important, is how you feel in your body when you're experiencing these activities. And for me, one of these practices is restorative yoga. And so restorative yoga is any practice that incorporates a restful posture. And also in restorative yoga, we often hold postures for several seconds or even up to several minutes at a time. This may include postures such as child's pose, which is a more familiar pose to many people. Yoga Nidra, also known as the yoga of sleep, which is a guided relaxation technique, is also one of my favorite practices. And there's also a bit of research about the impact of Yoga Nidra and the recovery of trauma. Practices for interoception, which I'm also referring to as self-awareness for some of my students who are newer to the practice. But essentially what I recommend, based on my own training in trauma-sensitive yoga, is pausing between movements or breathing exercises for reflection. And so this may look like taking a few breaths and then noticing how you feel after you take a few breaths, or maybe doing a series of postures and then noticing how you feel, noticing the difference between how you felt before your practice and then how you notice your body and your breath after the practice. Any awareness of breath and bringing your mind back to the present moment and simply noticing the breath without changing it, without making any judgments on the breath, simply being present and aware of the breath, is highly recommended by the modalities I've studied. Samvriti and Nadi Shodhana are two more specific breathing practices if you are a yoga teacher or a practitioner and are familiar with these breathing practices, these have also been recommended through the trainings I've attended in the recovery of trauma, specifically complex trauma. And in my own experience, I have also tremendously benefited from mindfulness practices, especially those in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, and these include the 5 mindfulness trainings. This is discussed in the book I recommended earlier, which is called Flowers in the Dark, and also the Mindful Movement series by Thich Nhat Hanh. In Ayurveda, the nervous system is related to Vata dosha, and a significant part of my journey in healing my own nervous system has been through the practices of Ayurveda, specifically Dinacharya, which relates to our daily routines. A few practices for pacifying Vata dosha include eating warm, heavy, oily, nourishing foods such as khichdi, herbal teas such as tulsi, which is a wonderful adaptogen, and it's also tridoshic, so it's beneficial for all doshas or constitutions, and warm milks such as golden milk or turmeric milk. Abhyanga, which is a form of massage with warm sesame oil, and I highly recommend organic and unrefined sesame oil for this practice. This is incredibly nourishing to the nervous system. I recommend self-massage with warm sesame oil in the evening before bed, and you can also take a shower or a hot bath after the massage. There's a heavy emphasis on routines in general, but especially sleep routines, such as turning off screens for a period of time before sleep, reading before sleep, journaling before sleep, or any other type of nourishing or uplifting activities before bed. Uplifting, supportive people, environment, and activities. And this sounds incredibly simple, but as a survivor of trauma, I cannot highly recommend the importance of these simple activities. And so one of the hardest decisions that I've had to make as a survivor is to really evaluate the relationships in my life and the environments in my life, and to really critically evaluate whether or not they're conducive to my own healing. And that has led me to make a series of difficult decisions about my life. In addition to that, it is not always easy for me to find time as a parent and business owner for activities that are meaningful and uplifting to me. But I notice that when I do find the time for these activities, which may be hiking or cooking or spending time with friends or going to the beach or any other practices I might enjoy, it is incredibly nourishing to my nervous system to simply be in a place of joy and creativity. In general, Vata craves routine in diet, sleep, and exercise. And so in creating a dinacharya or a daily routine through the lens of Ayurveda, simply creating a routine for yourself that you can follow on a regular or even semi-regular basis can be incredibly supportive to the nervous system overall. A few final thoughts. What did you learn about trauma today? What steps can you take to learn more about trauma? What steps can you take to incorporate a trauma-informed lens into your sales, marketing, operations, and human resources? And what steps can you take on your own healing journey to become an effective trauma-informed leader? Thank you all so much for being here today and for being a part of this experience with me. I would love to hear your thoughts anytime, so please reach out via email or my website or through social media. I would love to hear from you all anytime. Thank you all so much and take care.